So, hello and welcome to a talk that's hosted jointly today by the MRC, IEU and the Data Visualization Interest Group here at the university. We're very lucky to have with us today Dr. Will Stahl-Timmins, who is data graphics designer at the BMJ, who's going to talk us through the process of producing graphics to make complex health information understandable and hopefully give us a few tips about how to do it ourselves. So thank you very much, Will.
Thank you very much for coming out on this wet and stormy day. I really appreciate it. I've always loved visual communication. Growing up here in Bristol, I had 4 much older brothers who were all artists or designers. So when my turn came, I went to art school. It's just kind of what you did in my family. And I studied graphic design, which I absolutely loved. But I think my tutors always realised that there was something a bit odd about me. I remember filling pages and pages of one of my sketchbooks with a big diagram which showed all of the animated transitions I'd need for a piece I was working on, and it was covered in calculations, and I'd worked out that it was all based on a Fibonacci sequence. I'm sure that they took one look at that diagram and thought, what on earth do we do with this? So when all of the other graduates went on to glamorous roles in corporate identity and advertising, I went to Exeter Medical School and learned about systematic reviewing and meta-analysis and thought long and hard about how to present medical research data visually. And I found out that there was this whole world called data visualization or infographics. People were using visual elements like colour, shape, position, size to represent data. Finally, the Fibonacci-loving designer had found a home. And I went on to do a postdoc and sort of thought about how to present research data, tried to submit that to journals, mostly failed. There wasn't really any way of publishing interactive graphics, there wasn't really that much in terms of making massive posters and things like that, let alone 3-dimensional graphics. So I decided to go and change things from the inside. Now I work for the BMJ. You may well be aware that it's quite an august publication. It's been published since about 1840 in various forms. Has a weekly print journal. Obviously, it's online first, but we still have that kind of unique channel to medical practitioners. We publish, obviously, world-class research, but we also publish news and comment and education pieces. So I think that's kind of an interesting channel to get research into the hands of practicing doctors. And every week, it drops through their letterbox onto their doormat, and this is what happens. This is what we call the pile of guilt. They know that they should be reading this stuff. It's full of, really vital stuff, new, the cutting-edge research. But it turns out doctors are really busy, actually, trying to make a difference in the world, and don't have a lot of time to keep abreast of that. So that's, I think, where I came in. I started working there about 5 years ago, and we started looking at how we could present information a bit better. And it's kind of unsurprising that happens when what we publish sometimes looks a bit like this. This is the online PDF of an article about gender pay gap in NHS organisations. It's very useful information, but it's not exactly exciting to look at. So instead we decided to make something that looks a bit more like this, and people can have short amounts of text, they can scroll down, they can see all the different organisations, they can look at which ones are more equal than others, they can play with it, see that information, and if they're really interested in that, then they can click through to the full article and learn about where that data comes from. That's the kind of flashy interactive stuff, but actually a lot of the things that we produce are just static A4 graphics like this. They go in a page of the print journal, you can download a PDF. I started off making mostly interactives, but now I make a lot more statics, just because it's really easy to share them on social media, it's much quicker, they can go in both the print journal and online, people can access them offline more easily. Some of them get turned into posters like this one, so we started off publishing one, and an organisation who was interested in that condition, this is a nice guidance on spondyloarthritis, and they came to us and said, well, this only deals with the diagnosis part, what about the management? And so we made a whole poster that covered the whole guidance for them, and that went out with a print journal. Another interactive here, this is a complex diagnosis problem, so you have different ways that you could look at post-operative chest pain, different dimensions that you could consider about what to do and sort of narrow down on what this might be caused by. And that appears to be the right side. Okay. This is our rapid recommendations graphics, which is kind of a standard template. We have often 2 different interventions or more that we're looking at. And people can get the kind of top-line message of recommendation. This is all based on a big systematic review, but they can also drill down into the detail a bit more and find more information if they're interested. And we now have a big collection of them, bmj.com/infographics. And there's some of the most accessed content that we have on Facebook and Twitter. People really like to share them and reach out using that. So how do we make these graphics? I'll take you on the journey of one that we made 2 years ago now, linked with a researcher in Exeter who was looking at the NICE guidance on cancer referral pathways. And the print team were having a real problem trying to put this onto page. This is their attempt to try and squeeze all these tables into a printed page. And there were 13 different sets of symptoms to look for and different diagnoses, different referral pathways. So they came to me on a Wednesday, I think, and our print edition goes to press on a Tuesday. So we had about a week to get this data into some kind of interesting shape. First place I always start is with a pencil and paper, trying to work out what kind of referral pathways there were, what kind of symptoms we were looking at, whether there's any crossover or anything I could sort of break down into that. Try to kind of vertical layout like that, where you have symptoms at the top and then you're going through the referral pathways down to the bottom, and that didn't seem to work. Tried a kind of weird one with stuff on the left and then squeezed into the middle, and that didn't really work. Quickly settled on something which went across 2 pages. I don't normally like to do that, but in this case it seemed to fit the data better. And then, because there wasn't that much time, we kind of got that approved, started throwing the data onto the page, linking up the lines. This is the page fold in the middle there, so this is going across the bottom of 2 different pages. Changed the sort of line frequency, sort of widths, and tried to make that crossover not so difficult, played with the colours a bit, and ended up with something that looked a bit like that. Moved the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma inside the lymphoma bubble, just as a suggestion. And there it is on the printed page. Went across the bottom of those 2. Took a bit less space in the tables and was a bit easier to understand. Went on the front cover, we were all very pleased. Went off for a beer. Came in the office the next day and they said, "We've got the adult guidelines this week. This has got 96 sets of symptoms that you have to present." So I told them that couldn't be done. I worked out that it would have taken, that was kind of just 1 set. I sort of squished them up as much as I could. Realised it would take 4 pages of the journal to present all of these different pathways. Told them that. Waited for them to tell me that I didn't need to do it. And then they gave me 4 pages. So it was an absolute mess. I didn't particularly like this, but that's how it kind of ended up. Spread across the pages of the journal. But luckily, we did get a chance to revisit that, because NICE saw it, came back and said, "We'd like to have a poster version of this." Tried sort of splitting it out into 2 sides, which clearly was a very bad idea. That didn't work at all. Kind of went back a little bit, spread out that box in the centre to make it a bit more, give kind of an instruction for every single one rather than just the ones that you needed further investigations for. Was a little bit panicked at the top there when they were starting to really squeeze the bubbles up, but luckily there was a bit more space down the bottom. By spreading that out, tried a few different ways of doing that. That really didn't work. Straight lines really didn't work. Went back to curved lines. Added on some little diagrams on the left there. Show you a little bit about which body parts you were sort of looking at. Changed the colours to fit with the other one, and then it ended up as this 4-page poster. And we had a couple of CTGs requesting versions of this that they can send out to all their GPs. And one of our clinical editors who works as a local GP in London occasionally sends me photos of this pinned up in doctor surgeries, which is always really nice. So that was, I suppose, a quite unusual project in some ways, in that it was very time pressured and we had little time to work on it, but we could then go back to it at the end and refine it. More normally, we'll have something like this. This is another 69-page manuscript. This is about sepsis. It's a big review of all of the literature on sepsis that's currently published. Again, start with a pencil and paper. In this case, an Apple iPad and an Apple Pencil. But the same principle applies. It's just the quickest way of getting your ideas out. Different colours of different parts of the paper, and I was just exploring what kind of things could be presented. And always different options. So this is 4 different ideas ways we might have presented that data. There's always so many different ways you could treat a particular data set. In this case, we went with this one in the bottom right here, a person lying in a ICU with various different boxes around them. Sent that one off to a professional illustrator to get the artwork, which then went to our clinical editors, and they told us what was wrong with it. No, you need cut sides on there, you need a bag over the feeding and so forth. We get people right in otherwise all the time. We've done it wrong. Then we've got the artwork, worked out how to overlay the information onto that. Tried a couple of different ideas, maybe having a sort of vanishing point, but actually the flat one ended up much easier to see, particularly at small sizes. And then we break that down, turn the version I've drawn into an SVG, scalable vector graphics format, put a set of data behind that, which is just in a CSV file, and then use normally D3 to code that up so that when people click on stuff, things happen. And then we get this kind of little simple interactive that just drops in at the top of the article, and people can click on it and see information. These are basically all the various different treatments, and the green ones are the ones that are currently recommended, and the red ones are the ones that have dropped off the scale, and there's some uncertainty with the purple ones. So information graphics, or data viz, or infographics, or data journalism, or whatever you want to call it. There's so many different terms for it. It takes many different forms, as I'm sure it's been being part of the data viz interest group. And some of the simplest forms are charts and graphs, how long have these kinds of things been around, do we think? Bar charts and pie charts. Any ideas? Weekly? Any ideas, roughly?
300?
A bit less than 300, actually. But around that, not far, sort of 200, 300. These are all designed by a Scottish economist called William Playfair, who is a real proponent of these kind of techniques. And he spent a lot of time arguing that you could represent time as a horizontal axis, and no one believed him. For tens and 20 years it took him to prove that point. Truly, we stand on the shoulders of giants. They've done a lot of work for us. And sometimes these kind of techniques are actually really useful because people have seen them before and they understand them. I can't do a talk about health and data visualization without talking about Florence Nightingale, who realised that a lot of deaths in the Crimean War were caused by poor hygiene instead of actually, soldiers' injuries, which is represented by the blue wedges here. And she really knew what she was doing. These polar diagrams that she drew are all area-based, which is kind of how we would do graphics today. So this is not a new thing. This is something that people have been working on, and working on really effectively for hundreds of years. I'm sure you've all seen Charles-Joseph Minard as well. The March to Moscow. This is a classic graphic which shows the amount of troops remaining in Napoleon's army as he marched to Moscow with the width of this line. Oh, that's the pink one there. And then the black one is their subsequent retreat as the forces dwindle. And you can see there's also a graph of temperature at the bottom there. It's got about 7 different dimensions of data. You've got sort of position, scale, direction, temperature. Everything is kind of laid out there. There's obviously this huge amount of innovation. This was published in 1869 as well. So that whole period, there was a real sense of the possibilities of data visualization. This is designed by an Irish steam engineer called Captain Henry Matthew Phineas Riall Sankey. He developed the Sankey diagram, which you probably have seen quite a lot these days. It's similar to Minard's diagram, actually, in that it represents the width of the lines represents a quantity. In this case, it's the flow of energy around a steam engine. There's another slightly more complex example of a Sankey diagram that was designed in 1972, and it shows the UK textile industry. So the left-hand side we have raw materials, cotton and wool and things like that. Then we have yarn production, so they get spun into different yarns. Those get churned into different fabrics, and then at the end they turn their end uses. Now, what's significant about the fact that that's designed in 1972? What do we not have in 1972? The first Apple computer was made in 81, so this was all drawn by hand. And it's kind of amazing that someone would go to that length to do that, but clearly that shows you how valuable the techniques are, that someone would spend that time plotting that out and doing that information. Now we have much more simple tools. This is a Sankey diagram made on the raw website, and we can just drop the data in and see it appear before our eyes. Maps and data maps, lots of fun things to do there. This is a map of earthquakes in California and showing the depth of the earthquakes and the magnitude. There's an example of a cartogram there where you represent sort of population or another sort of quantity by scaling areas to the number of people within them rather than their geographical area. And then this is about transport times in London by a company called Stamen, interactive maps there. Again, data maps have been around a long time. Probably should mention John Snow as well while we're here. The cholera epidemic, probably know this one as well. I think the most interesting thing about this diagram to me, he plotted all these cases on a map surrounding this water pump in the centre there in Broad Street, which turned out to be the source of the infection. I think he made this map after the event to sort of explain this rather than take off the handle and then the world was saved, as I've heard people say before. But it would be much, much harder to see that information as a list of addresses. You just wouldn't see that sort of clustering effect if it was in that form. Good old Harry Beck and his tube map. And again, what he understood really he was an electronics engineer and he understood circuit diagrams, and he knew that what was important in the circuit diagram was the connections, and realised that actually the same was true of someone travelling on a train. They need to know where they change, where they get off. That's the information they need to know, and that's simplified everything greatly. And that's been much emulated around the world now. So almost every large city that has an underground network has one of these diagrams. You heard of Otto and Marie Neurath and the isotype movement? Oh, they're fascinating. Should you go and look at them? They worked in Austria before the Second World War and then escaped to the UK. But they did amazing work in trying to explain statistics to people with very low levels of literacy. This was an example of the benefits of mass production. So the left-hand side of the diagram shows production in the USA of cars in 3 different years, and the right-hand side is the rest of the world. And that sort of what looks like a decorative feature at the top is actually their way of explaining, this country has mass production and has all these systems. And the kind of idea of using an icon that represents what you're counting was so helpful for them to communicate with people with low levels of literacy and numeracy that they use this technique a lot. Do look up isotype. Fascinating history. This is another diagram about malaria made by Marie Neurath, who was really a kind of driving force behind the Isotype Foundation, and did a lot of work in Nigeria. Diagrams, I'm also really interested in diagrams. These aren't really necessarily data visualizations, but they are a really interesting way of combining text and image to explain something. And this is a diagram by a designer called Max Gadney, who's amazing. And he works for World War II magazine. I have no interest in World War II at all, but I would read this graphic. That is, just the way that they talked about the development of different aircraft and sort of brings it all together. He did one, I think, where he wanted to punch holes in the page for the gauge of different bullets that different aircraft used. I don't think they let him do that, but I think they had some circles instead with a bit of shading to make it look like they were punched in the page. Motion graphics. This is a very old video now by a band called Royksup, which is trying to play to you, but that seems like it's not necessary. And it's an entire music video made of different diagrams linked together. And I kind of think that shows something really useful about information graphics. The way that they reveal the invisible. When we pull a toilet flush, we don't see any of that connection and what happens afterwards and what happens. But one amazing thing about graphics and visualization is that you can sort of bring that to light, those invisible things. I barely touched on interactives. This is an early example of a graphic made by someone called Moritz Stefaner, who's a very, very successful, multi-award-winning data visualization guru, I suppose, who one of his early graphics, this one, was about quality of life in different countries in the EU. And you can change the sliders there to see which kind of countries we would once have been able to go and live and work in.
Still can't.
Yeah, I know. And then This is one by Pitch Interactive on drone strikes. I think, again, a really effective visualization that you can walk through and learn about the sort of civilian casualties and how drones have been affected. That a really effective color palette, really good bit of storytelling, visual storytelling. Storytelling. So this is, I showed you that piece earlier that I was looking at the gender pay gap in different NHS organisations. So it's something that we're trying a bit at the BMJ now, and this is a process become very popular in a lot of media sites now, that you can just scroll through, read short texts, and then you'll see the images on the left change. So here's a map morphing into points on a graph, and you can sort of play around with that and sort of lead people through a story with data and look at it in different dimensions. They're a little tricky to set up, but they can be really effective. Look at the Pudding website, pudding.cool. That has a whole load of different storytelling. They really love it there. That's definitely their thing. Some people don't like it. Some people think it's a bit too kind of prescriptive and it's too slow to go through. But I think they serve their purpose. And a whole bunch of other things. If there's one link that I should really point out if you don't know it yet, visualizingdata.com, Andy Kirk's blog. He just is a machine who collects interesting data visualizations, and every couple of months he'll come up with a massive list of all the things that I've missed for the last, I don't know how he does it, but he seems to just spend his life trawling through for interesting graphics. So do have a look at that one. Information is Beautiful. I should mention David McCandless has set up that website that has so many different resources. The awards that they run every year have some amazing pieces in there. So if you're ever stuck for inspiration, that's another good place to look. Visual complexity tends to be a bit overcomplicated. I mean, it's right down in the name, right? I suppose I should expect that. But there's still some really interesting pieces there. And density design are the people who designed the raw tool that I talked about earlier, and I will talk about again in a minute. So, why have I put that as a pair discussion? Why do we visualize data? I thought I'd edited that out. But why do we? Why are we visualizing data? What's the reason for doing it?
Make it clearer.
Make it clearer? Yeah, that makes good sense. Yeah. Sorry, there was another one as well.
To help people understand.
Help people understand? Yeah, it does help people understand, I think, visualizing it, in case you can see the picture a bit more.
Additional insight.
Okay, that's interesting. So sort of pattern finding, looking at what's happening within the data set. Yeah, it's good to eyeball it.
Really fast.
Really fast, yeah. So you get that message really, really quickly. You don't have to spend so long looking through the data.
Spotting problems with data.
Spotting problems? Oh yeah, outliers. Yeah, that's a good one. I don't think I've got that one there. That's useful. I'm sorry, you said.
And to draw people into it in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's really important, just to actually get people to pay attention. And I think you've probably covered most of this. Yeah, explaining, engaging the audience, as you say. Efficient communication, so there's that speed that we were talking about in the quick overview. Enabling comparisons is a really good one as well. It's very much easier to compare two quantities. It comes into all of the things you were saying. And I find it's useful to make information fit into a small space, but maybe that's just because I work in a print journal and we always have limited space. But yeah, no, it's a good point about outliers. I haven't had that one, and I should do. Every time I do this, someone comes up with a new reason to add on to this. Just collecting them as I go along. I think normally mostly comes down to either exploration or explanation. And I suppose work more on the explanation side, because the work that I do has been already, the exploration has happened. Someone's found something. They want to get that message out there, and I kind of help them take that second part. But exploration is very important as well, in terms of most of the stats guides that you read will say, eyeball your data first before you do your tests. The trouble is that then people publish that graph that they've used for their exploration, and that is not what someone needs to see. They need to go a step further and change it into something that's usable and understandable. So why do we do this, and how do we know about what happens when people see visual information versus other forms of information? I'm going to just step you through this randomised study that I did when I was a postdoc at University of Exeter. A few years ago now, I think, maybe about 6 years ago I left there, so it's a while ago now, but I think still applicable. I was working with a couple of psychologists and experts in the impacts of the environment on health, And we came up with these two graphics, and they were matched with two different texts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report about floods and storms and air quality and disease. And they're about sort of 2,000 words or so of text. And then we realised that the information was quite non-linear. Like, you had to hold a lot in your mind at the same time. There were a lot of things that impacted other things and things that impacted knock-on chains of effect. So we decided to try and design this kind of infographic version of them and compare them with what happened. About 1,000 people, split into 6 groups. They either saw nothing, a text, or a graphic. One of the two texts or one of the two graphics. And then we asked them a few questions about their knowledge afterwards. So what kind of impacts will floods and storms have? Where will it impact? That kind of stuff. Then we asked them questions about how much they liked what they'd seen, how much they thought that it would be a risk to them, and a little bit about their characteristics. Then we gave them a 2-week break and came back and asked them the same questions again, and the same risk perception questions again. So I'm going to show you some slightly weird graphs that have points with confidence intervals, and then black and white boxes for whether an ever test is significant or non-significant, and then we've got the 3 conditions: control, text, and graphic. First of all, approval. Did they like them? They liked the graphics a bit more. I don't know if that's that interesting, really, but they had better colours, so I would kind of expect that. In terms of time, they actually spent a lot less time. We recorded how long they looked at them. They could click through whenever they were done with them. And they spent a lot less time looking at the graphics, so they kind of sped through them. But in terms of knowledge, they seem to end up with quite a lot more knowledge after looking at the graphics. But they had a bit more out of the text in the air quality group, but mostly it's the graphics that are helping them, even though they spent less time looking at them. In terms of risk perception, again, a little bit higher after seeing the graphic, so they maybe took on board the risk a bit better or understood that a bit better. And then we give them that 2-week break. Here's the baseline. So I've squished all the groups together now, so this is just control, graphic, text, and that's the baseline. What do you think happened after 2 weeks to their knowledge?
Graphic stays.
Graphic stays? That's what we hoped. They totally forgot. All way. That's it. But asking them about their risk perception, that was the baseline, and that actually stayed a bit more in the graphics group. So it's almost like they understood something about the risks. They didn't remember the detail, but they remembered that they had that they had thought that it was more impactful, and something was kind of on that level might be still staying. So, there may be something there. This is, quite a small experiment, but and there we go. The other thing I found quite interesting, and this was slightly an incidental finding, is that we broke them down into 10-year age groups. And the group on the text had this really interesting pattern where people who were in the youngest age group, 18 to 27, definitely didn't get as much out of it as the older people. So it looked at it another way. If you're in the oldest age group, it didn't really matter if you saw the text or graphic, you'd get that information. But if you're in the youngest age group, the graphic is way better than the text that explains it to you. And I don't know why that is. I can guess that it might be because people are now more used to seeing things in a non-linear way, making their own way through information, more used to graphics. They don't have that skill of refining a text into an idea in their minds so much. But, obviously, further research needed, as always. So, yeah, this one, I think, could be used to communicate this kind of information. For this particular audience, and it was, an online survey, so that has its limitations. And you could use this to present other non-linear graphics, but I was kind of fed up of seeing studies that say, this means graphics are brilliant, and all graphics are brilliant. They're so individual. You could almost give 2 people the same set of data, and they'd come up with completely different graphics, and they would test totally differently. So, don't take this as the fact that graphics are always good, but sometimes they can be. Sometimes these kind of techniques can be useful. Right. Audiences. What kind of people do you need to present data to in your working lives?
Commissioners.
Commissioners, yeah, that makes sense. Others? Policymakers, yeah, that affect policy, yeah.
Funders.
Yeah, always good. Yeah, get something nice graphic on the funding bid and it looks great. Stands out above the others. Yeah, public as well, increasingly. People are increased to get their research out there, let patients and public know. Definitely always good to remember those needs of your audience and think about how you're designing and try and work out do you need multiple graphics for different audiences? How does that work? This is an example I've totally stolen from Jacques Bertin, who is a French geographer, I suppose, who did a lot of work on mapping, and he realised that different people would need different information. Here's a list of different amounts of population change in different regions in France. So can you tell me if there's generally more migration away from the southwest of France or from the northeast of France in 2011? How's the French geography? Much easier to do that with a map. You can see there's much more blue colours, which is a higher, you have to know what the scale is, but that's a higher rate of population change away than from the southwest and towards the northeast. Could you tell me what the exact rate of population change in Limousin is? It depends on your French geography for a start, because it's not labelled. But also, even if you did know that, you would have to work out what that shade was on that scale exactly, and then change that into a value, and you still wouldn't really know exactly. This would actually work much better for you if you needed an exact value. So do remember that different people have different audiences. Different people have different needs, and the simplest way to do this is to test your graphic. I'm not saying you have to do a 1,000-strong online panel for every graphic you make, but show it to a few people. It could be a fairly, informal test. Get it out there. See what kind of information they pull out of it. Even if it just takes a little while. We do that with all the graphics that we make. We show them to the other clinical editors. We share them with the authors of the paper. We get feedback on them. So I'm going to talk a little now about different ways that you might make graphics. I know that you're all from various different places and have different levels of skill in terms of data visualization and familiarity with it. How many of you are from this kind of medical research community? Quite a lot. And from other schools in the university? There are quite a few as well. And how about familiarity with data visualization? Who thinks that they know absolutely everything there is to know about data visualization? Not me. Great, okay, and sort of middle sort of level of exploration, they've done a few bits and pieces okay, great. You know what D3 is and do things. And how about people who are really just starting with it and are interested to do more? Oh, great, so more on that side. Cool. I'll probably pitch the talk okay then, that's good. So we'll talk a little bit about different kind of production methods. Obviously, number one, get published in the BMJ, you work with me, and then it's fine. you work with that, didn't you? That worked well, didn't it? Okay. But other ways you could do it if you've got your own data set to work with. I think it slightly depends on the complexity of the data and how long you have and what the kind of end result is. But I think there are four kind of main ways that you can think about doing it. And number one, using standard graph tools, is not to be disparaged, actually, because as we saw earlier, these things have been around for hundreds of years. People have refined them. They've done a lot of the work for you, and your audience will understand them because they've seen bar charts and line charts before. And if you're making something, quickly putting something out from, a spreadsheet program is actually a fine way of looking at data. All of your stats packages that you use, I'm sure, will spit out graphs in all sorts of different formats, and you can use that as a way of exploring your data. Really useful. I would say that if you're publishing something further, there are ways that you can make slightly better looking and easier to use graphs. You can add annotations and things, and using tools like Infogram. Also, there is AnyChart, which again has lots of different graph tools that you can just put data into and spit something out. And they just look a little bit more refined than just using something from a basic stats package. Data Wrapper actually is a really good example. They've got a good annotation tool, so you can add sort of notes, point things out, get a little bit more kind of explanatory about your. I think that's a word. You can explain better. There we are. Number two, there are quite a few existing specialist data visualizations tools out there. I mentioned one of them before. Raw is one of my favourites. raw.densitydesign.org. They have an awful lot of different tools. Again, you can just upload a CSV file to it. You can assign different bits of data to different elements. They have a really good Sankey diagram tool. They have some nice bubble chart tools. and you can export in all sorts of different formats. So I really would, if you've got a slightly sort of higher level of complexity to your data, or you want something a little bit more unusual to grab people's attention, give that one a try. The Flourish website also has a lot of interesting tools. With that, you can even make sort of stories that you step through, so that you can make a map of the world or something and highlight points on it, and then the user can click through and it will rotate to different points, and you can, add things like that. It's really easy to use, and it'll look, really professional as well.
Were these all free?
Those ones are both free. They're free versions. It depends if you want your things to be public or not. If you want them to be private, then you have to pay. But mostly those ones are all free. This one is not free. Tableau software. It's kind of the end of data visualization that I don't really deal with, that exploration end. People who do business intelligence use this a lot, and it's really good if you've got a lot of different data sets that you want to try looking at in different ways, and you can just drag things to different axes and things will pop up. But I have actually started to see some really interesting visualizations made with these kinds of tools now. I saw an amazing one about a symphony and an orchestra, and they made symbols for all of the instruments, and they lit up when they were being played, and you could see exactly when they were all played. So that was all made in Tableau. So there's some amazing stuff you can do with it. It's not free, it's not cheap, but if you're doing a lot of exploration of your data and trying to sort of move things around, that can be useful. Its main competitor is Power BI, business intelligence software from Microsoft. They're trying to get in on that market as well, obviously. Very business-oriented organisation. And then number 3. So this is what I do. I do it by hand. Obviously, this takes a lot longer, and you're limited in terms of what you kind of have access to in terms of the skills. So it might be that you end up working with a specialist to do this. And I've had really good experiences working with different design schools and things. You've got UE here in Bristol. I'm sure that they would be interested in collaborating if you've got an interesting data set or challenge for their students. Or if you've got a bit of money added onto a budget for dissemination at the end, really good to maybe add in something about working with information designers who can actually represent your data and have the skills to do that. People go to university for 5-10 years. 10 years they go to university for 3 years and then have years of experience developing the skills in typography and layout and colour, and I don't think academics should always be expected to know all this stuff automatically. So do if you can work with people, and that will be probably a similar process to what we do at the BMJ, that you'd end up working with them, and they would start sketching out ideas. If it's a good information designer, they'll give you a few things to choose from and involve you and work out what exactly your requirements are. And this was a project that I did on how pharmaceutical waste gets into the environment. And we started with a kind of really basic diagram there with a few notes on it. And the thing I found really interesting about this process is this is when I was a postdoc and I was working with some psychologists and environmental scientists. And it always strikes me when I work with scientists how fantastically creative they are. Going to art school, I was told that we were the creative ones and the science people were boring, and that they would they had methods, results, and conclusions, and it was all very rigid and structured. But actually, I think scientists are some of the most creative people I've ever worked with. What you don't see is all the kind of blind alleys and decision-making that leads to that methods, results, conclusion. You don't see all of that sort of fantastic thought process that goes on there. And working with these people on this diagram, where I'd show them something and be like, oh yeah, that's great, let's add this on and this on, and how about we could represent that way? And it was a really good experience. And we turned it, in the end, got spiraled out of all control, and it turned into this massive A2 poster thing that we very fortunately won a prize and got published in Science. And the kind of software that we use for this, I do use mostly Google Sheets for data crunching, just to sort of get the data formatted in the right way. In terms of still graphics, my main tool is Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator. That's how we do all the page layouts. And InDesign as well. I've seen people use that for multi-page graphics. I've used it myself occasionally. Those kind of standard design tools are fine. You can put information into there, you can put colours into there, you can put positions into there, you can make whatever you like in that if you want to. In terms of motion graphics, it's just standard video editing software mostly, Premiere, Final Cut. Adobe Animate is quite useful, what used to be called Flash, but they've now, obviously that failed, so they've turned it into a kind of animation suite, which can output videos and things, which is really useful. And in terms of the interactive graphics that I've been showing, we mostly use, as I say, D3 for that, data-driven documents. It's a really flexible language that allows you to take data that's sitting in a JSON format or a CSV format and turn it into something that works really well on the web. You do need to know a bit of HTML and CSS and JavaScript to get the most out of that. So if you're really not into coding and want a slightly easier introduction to it, I started with a language called processing, which is really nice. It's developed by a couple of guys at MIT when they were doing their PhDs in genetics, and they needed a really good data visualization tool, and they developed processing, and it's really self-contained. It's kind of almost designed for artists and designers to introduce them to coding, but it's also really flexible for visualizing data in lots of ways. And as I say, it's all self-contained. You just need to learn one language, and it's really useful for that. I've added R there. I don't use it myself, but I know that there's loads of really good packages now. The Shiny package, all you can do with ggplot is quite useful anyway in the basic version, but there's loads more packages coming out for that. And I've seen people doing great things with R, particularly if they're familiar with it for the analysis of data in the first place. It's quite a good way to go. But other languages, I mean, it's amazing what you can do with the SVG format, the scalable vector graphic format. There's a whole load of different useful ways of laying out information with that, HTML and other programming languages. Insert your favourite programming language. Go wild. Oh yeah, so I just mentioned processing. This is, as I say, the one that's a bit easier to learn, and D3, the one that we learn. And that we use, and there's all sorts of different. There's a whole bunch of different standard tools you can pick up from the D3 library and enter your data into if you want to. It's really getting to the next stage of actually editing those and changing them around is a bit more difficult and might need a bit more training or experience, but it is a really good language. Okay, number 4. Sometimes if you're like me, you'll be making diagrams and you realise that you've made the same diagram 8 times and it is not worth hand coding it every time. This is a piece that I developed during my PhD, which is called the Graphical Overview for Evidence Reviews, or GOFA, if you like. And each row on that table represents a trial, and it gives a bit of information about that. So this is from a systematic review. Shows you a bit about where the trial was, how big it was, what kind of arms people were split into, something about the patient's characteristics, something about the quality of the study, and then what kind of outcomes they assess in the different trials. And this was, I think, maybe 10 pages like this. Everyone designed by hand in InDesign, all the points put in there. So yeah, obviously I had a lot more patience when I was a PhD student. So we decided actually that was a ridiculous way of doing it. First of all, there's a possibility of human error. We had to check this really carefully. And also it just takes ages. So if you think that you've come up with a good technique, we made a simple piece of software that took something that looked a little bit like a spreadsheet. You had to be really precise about exactly how you edited it in there, but it ended up with something that looked a little bit like that diagram. It's not quite as nice, but it's at least a starting point, and you could even get that and edit it a bit and sort of turn it into something a bit more nice looking. And we've been making this kind of diagram with the BMJ recently, so we're kind of starting that idea and thinking about how we can make tools that might be able to spit something like this out a bit more easily. This is kind of like part coded now and part hand done. I've kind of made it spit out most of the right things and then just tweak it at the end. So it's not quite at the state where other people can use it yet, but watch this space. And again, almost any language that you could do that in. I think that one that we made was just made in Python with a couple of different libraries. So there we are, 4 different ways, slightly depending on the complexity of the information you're working with and how often you do them, from standard graph tools to specialist data visualization tools, getting a professional involved and doing it by hand, or even making new tools that can be used multiple times. But if that really turns you off and you're not sure how you're going to get access to any of that, there is a secret number 5, which is, I've been quite interested in this recently, making physical graphics. A really simple example is the Sugar Stacks website, and they just get piles of sugar cubes and lay them out with soft drinks to show you how much sugar was in them. I was in a cathedral in Truro a couple of years ago and found this exhibition by performing artists called Stan's Cafe, and they were weighing out massive piles of rice. And the whole exhibition 1 grain of rice had to equal 1 person, and they were just accepting anyone's statistics and weighing it all out and making these big piles. So here in the front you have a little pile that shows the number of people living with HIV in the UK, and then this is the number of people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. And it just gives you a real kind of sense of perspective and scale very easily. This is a piece I made with some students at Falmouth University, actually, looking at energy use. So on the base, you have discs representing different countries, and the area of the disc represents that country's population, and the colour represents its position on the Human Development Index. So pinks are a bit lower, and blues are a bit higher. So we've got India and China in the front here, and the US is this sort of slightly darker blue circle in the back there. I think the UK is this one here. And the number of strings connected to those discs represent the energy, so electricity used by that country. And then the colour of the strings represents the source of generation for that electricity. So black is fossil fuels. Blue is actually hydroelectric, lots of that in China. Yellow is nuclear. There's a bit of a bigger concentration of that in the US at the back there. And then there's occasional green strands, which are all the other renewables put together. They're a really interesting project to work on. They were very creative students, and they came up with this for an exhibition. And yeah, it definitely got people talking. And then one last example, for the NHS's 70th birthday last year, we commissioned this piece from some artists working out of Goldsmiths in London, and they made us these 7 cabinets, each containing a marble run, made out of medical equipment, gloves and sharp spins, and so I think there's one made of speculums somewhere. And the length of time that it took for a marble to run through each of these runs, each run represents a different age group, so sort of 10-year age group, and the length of time that the marble took to run through represented the amount of money that the NHS spends on people in that age group on average. So the first one took a few seconds to go through. I think the sort of teenage years, it just bounces straight through and goes down the bottom. And then by the time you get up to sort of 80 to 90, it runs through in about 2 minutes. So it's really interesting to work with them again and see that sort of fantastic creativity that they put into that project. And that was, I think we commissioned it and wanted it there for 2 months, and it ended up being there for about 4 or 5 because everyone loved it so much. So there we go. 5 different ways of making graphics. I'll leave it there and leave some time for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. That was absolutely brilliant. No problem. So, does anyone have any burning questions? I might chip in with my own one to start off with.
I do.
So, are there any things you really wish that people would think about before they come to you at BMJ, that they could consider when they're submitting their paper?
Sometimes I think people think too much before coming to me.
Okay.
And people will come with this really fixed idea of what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And I will think it's totally wrong. I think there's often a lot of opinion in this as well. They may have a point sometimes, but I like to discuss with them, and I like to get in with the raw data and have a play around and see what different ways we can present something. So the less thinking, the better.
Brilliant. That is easy then.
So yeah, but I suppose it is nice when people sort of say, "This is the kind of audience I want to reach. This is the kind of message I want to have." But actually, doing any sketching or getting anything down or having a fixed idea about how you want to present information can be kind of awkward sometimes.
But so some journals now have graphical abstracts. Do you think that something?
Oh, I didn't put up our visual abstracts, did I? Yes, we have some as well. We've started making, I think, 1 a month at the moment. That's what we have the resources for. I really like them. I think they're good. It's a nice way of just quickly summarising a trial. Again, researchers and clinicians are really, really busy, and I think that helps them assess whether they can read something, whether they need to read that article, I suppose, is really, really useful. I suppose it is awkward trying to work out how to do them. We thought long and hard whether we would get author-submitted ones or whether we would make them, because obviously there's a resource implication and things like that. There are journals who make really simple ones on almost every paper, and we chose to do sort of slightly more complex and well-thought-through ones, but only do 1 a month. And they've been successful so far. They haven't been like mind-blowingly successful. I think it depends slightly on the paper, of course, how much people are interested in it. And all we can really go on is like our social media stats, because they're always in the page with an article, so it doesn't really, we don't really get any feedback that way. And they do kind of reasonably well, not as well as some of the full-page graphics normally, but they are kind of, shared more than just putting out something with boring text would be. So, yeah, we're still working on them, and I think they're promising.
Yeah.
You seem to have been working on health for a very long time. Probably that helps you identify what's in the data that could be interesting. So how much of that is just pure design competence? How much is you already being sort of half of a doctor?
That's an interesting question. I mean, don't let me know any patients for sure, unless I've made the graphic about it the last week or so. But yeah, I suppose when you get familiar with a data set, you do start to see patterns. Sometimes it can almost be a bit of an advantage not knowing exactly what everything means, because you see in categories then, you're kind of like, oh, that's a category of that, and that's a category of that. So then I need to add, sometimes you don't necessarily need to know what those categories are and what they represent. So I don't think it's essential to know absolutely everything about a field to work the messages from it. And I do work really closely with the authors and the editors before even putting pen to paper. We'll say, I've kind of gone through a process of working with them so that they now recognise when something is quite often going to be suitable for a graphic. So it's got lots of complex tables, it's got really non-linear narrative, or it's got multiple bits of information in different places that kind of need to be brought together. Those are all really kind of obvious points for making a graphic, and then they'll come to me and say, well, this is the paper, this is what it's about, this is why it's been written, this is the context, which is I find really useful for that. So I think they know much more about that than I do, and it's a process of kind of collaborating with people who have that expertise that I think makes a really good graphic.
Do you ever find that you have this really good idea for a graphic, and one of the novel ones, and you try it out, and because the audience that you're showing it to aren't familiar with it, they haven't seen your genius, and they haven't. But you're convinced that if you persist with it, it will be adopted. I mean, maybe with your experience with the one you made during your PhD.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I think you have to be very careful, because that kind of energy that it takes to interpret a new format is only sometimes worth the returns on that. So you need to have a really good reason for it if you're going to tell someone, oh, you just need to learn this entire new visual language that I've made up, which it does take some familiarity with. Yeah, in terms of when you're testing and it doesn't work, that can be frustrating. But sometimes you just got to realise that perhaps if they're not on board with it, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. And the reason for making one of these graphics is to communicate information. And if that transfer is not happening, it's more likely to be the graphics fault than the person that's using it. So you'll normally try and change things around. And it took William Playfair 20, 30 years to convince people that you could represent time on a horizontal axis. Sometimes you do need to keep at it sometimes.
Additional charges on top of article processing?
No, not at the moment. We haven't gone with that business model because we want the flexibility to choose where a graphic adds the most. Because, I could probably make a graphic for most papers, but there's only one of me, and we want to get the best content we can to our readers. So we don't do that at the moment. We just are very selective about which papers we decide to do that on. It is something that our business team is quite keen on, is sort of moving towards that. And when we do things like collections, sometimes we'll go to an international event and we'll launch a collection of articles on a particular subject and get experts from around the world, and we'll probably have a funder for that. And in that situation, they might pay for a graphic or a video or something like that. But in terms of the normal day-to-day articles, there's no additional charges on top of APCs.
Looks like BMJ has a GitHub. Do you publish the sort of underlying code and what license, or is there? Do you think there's an appetite at BMJ to increasingly share some of the frameworks that are being developed?
That's a good point. I mean, the graphics that we make are so individual. It's not like they could just take a different data set and run. I mean, each one has explanatory text about the article and has, specific rollovers about that particular thing. So I don't think they're going to be of much use to any other data set. So we haven't really looked at that at the moment. Having said that, we are starting to talk to a few different organisations about maybe making some kind of automated graph tool that will allow authors to sort of upload their data to the website and then create a graph out of that. And that might be something that would be more useful to the wider community that we might think about adding to our GitHub. Thanks.
So do you know how many other journals have a version of you, or if it's unusual? Or...
That's a good question. So most of the newspapers have probably not a me, but maybe about 25 me's. But the graphics teams at The Guardian and the Financial Times and Washington Post and places like that normally have specialists. So some people who are really good at the coding side, some people who are really good at the design side, some people who are really good at the data side. And they all work together and across different projects, and they sort of know a bit of all of the stuff, but they have their specialisms. So I think it's more unusual to have someone who knows everything that there is to know about data visualization. I certainly don't. And there are people who are out there who are much better designers than me, definitely people who are much better coders than me, because I come from the design side. So it's a strange skill set. And that is kind of one of the things I really like working in data visualization, is that you do get people coming from all sorts of different angles. David McCandless, who runs Information is Beautiful, was a journalist before he started doing data visualization and taught himself to do the design side. Edward Tufte, who writes a lot about data visualization, is a statistician. And although I may argue with some of his kind of really prescriptive ways of sort of rule making around graphics, he has made some really good contributions to the field, and he comes, totally from a stats background. So yeah, people always come from somewhere and slowly bolt on different bits, and that's what I've done. I've come from design and I've slowly added on the data stuff and slowly added on a bit of coding and sort of made my way slowly up that massive mountain. And yeah, I think people do that. The other medical journals, not so much, but certainly the newspapers are way ahead of us. And we are kind of halfway between a medical journal and a magazine, so it kind of fits with that for us. Thank you. Good question.
Do you have any advice for people starting out in this?
What was it like to start out in this? Just try and do everything. Explore. It was really amazing coming across this kind of community. Join the Data Visualization Society Slack channel for a start. I mean, there's so many different great ideas on there, and just talk to everyone. Experiment. Try 18 different ways of laying out the same information. Read everything you can. I don't know. It's a long journey, but it's a really fun one.
Brilliant. I've got no more questions.
Perfect.
Thanks, Will, again.